We've talked a lot about using verbal directions to make adjustments to our posture and to improve how we gesture, how we move. Today, I want to emphasize something that I perhaps haven't drawn enough attention to. The directions that we use exist in the context of a model. Our understanding of that model is crucial to effectively applying our directions. Before we discuss this model that we're talking about, let's look at why directions can't work in and of themselves. We frequently use the direction to lift the iliacs at the front of the pelvis back and up. At first, we may struggle to make that movement happen, but typically with a little time and some feedback, we can get this rotation going. But what is the limiting factor on this movement? If we tried to endlessly pull our iliacs back and up, eventually we would rotate the pelvis back and down. That can happen in sitting. In standing, you'd end up out of balance, so most would never go that far. But theoretically, if we kept going back and up with the iliacs, that should bring us to the floor. Now that's obviously an absurd example, but it illustrates the point. There's also the common objection I get to the directions to move the tips of the elbows out, down, and forward. If you continued that movement to its extreme, you would end up narrowing your arms at the front. It seems something is missing here. So what is this model that I'm talking about? We've discussed it a lot on this channel. The model I use was formulated by Jean Massouero, and it's based around lengthening the fascia of the body by manipulating primarily the bony structures of the body. Let's return to the iliacs back and up direction. Part of our model says that we want to vertically line up the iliacs, 8th ribs, lower sternum, and upper sternum when seen from the side. Our model also says that we want the lower back to be flat from just above the buttocks to the armpit line. So we know we don't want the iliacs further back in space than the frontal plane of the body, and we know we don't want to round our back. That means there is a very clear limit on how far back and up the iliacs should go. That limit isn't contained inside of the verbal directions, it's in the model. When we first start working with conscious control, we find that we sometimes can't get the movements to happen. We send a signal to rotate the iliacs back and up, and if we're a beginner, we might have a 50-50 shot of succeeding. A good chunk of the time, we may accidentally move the sit bones back and actually move the iliacs a little bit forward. To overcome this, we often feel we need to put a huge amount of effort into making the movement that we want, if we want it to actually happen. But before long, you should be able to make a relatively simple movement like pulling the iliacs back and up away from the side of the knee. It won't be perfect every time, but you'll get the hang of it and implement it with regularity. It's quite necessary that you then dispense with this idea of just applying a huge effort to get the movement to happen. Instead, you want to think of it as a movement. You are moving your iliacs back and up, with the goal of getting them in line with the frontal plane. When it comes to the arms, part of our model says that we want the tips of the elbows to point out away from the body and to be in front of the frontal plane of the torso. The arms should be able to hang with gravity. That means vertically straight. So obviously, we do not want to pull the tips of our elbows so far forward that we bend the arm against gravity, or bring the arms well forward of the frontal plane to even be moving in towards the center of the body by narrowing the shoulders. As you can see, the model is made up of a number of smaller models. We also model gestures. We've started to look at our model of how to sit down into a chair, or simply lower ourselves in space. We've laid out that we want to bend at only the knee and hip joints to start the gesture, and not bend at the ankle joints. We also looked at the idea of moving the pelvis back in space without pointing the sit bones dramatically back. We had the direction to keep the sit bones forward towards the thigh as we move the hips back. Obviously, the sit bones will move back along with the pelvis, and in all actuality, the pelvis must rotate with the torso, meaning the sit bones will go back a bit, and the back of the pelvis will be tilted. Does that mean our direction is wrong? No. The direction is to prevent the common habit of poking the sit bones back. Since the vast majority of people will have that problem when they try to get their hips back, the direction to keep the sit bones forward is massively helpful. But the direction is not the end-all be-all. The direction only really makes sense in the context of an accurate model. Having a model allows us to actually reason about our body and our movements. With a model, we can understand the effect of multiple concerted movements, which will often be a rotation. We can see how a rotation should affect a structure, and we can decide where we want to place the center of rotation based on the effect we want to produce. It's quite difficult to do these things outside the context of a model. We can also project the model in our mind as we make an adjustment or gesture. We can say, based on my model, if I place the center of rotation for my rib cage at the height of the armpit line, I should be able to rotate forward and up above the line and go back and up below the line. Then we can test that out and see if it's possible to live up to the model in reality. If we're going to change a long-held habit of movement, we need a clear understanding of what we're trying to do instead. The way for us to get around the stranglehold of our feeling sense is to externalize the matter. We do that with a model that we can consider and reason about abstractly. When you first start off, you might model a very simple movement, like the rotation of the upper arm. You might make an observable model of that movement with a cylindrical object, and see why placing the center of rotation at the front makes sense for our purposes. Most people can essentially immediately put that model into practice with their own arm. They don't need to understand the model of the entire body or the model of every gesture in order to put into practice this piece of the model. They really don't have to understand even what a model is to make a sort of translation of the rotation of the object to the rotation of their arm. But they are, in practice, using the model to project a set of orders for a movement of their body. And as you gain skill in implementing a model, it will become easier for you to do. Before long, you will be able to hold a more complex model in mind and apply 2, 3, 5, 10 movements at once. That might sound impossible, and it is to someone who has never used model-based reasoning in relation to their movements, but it's something everyone is capable of doing. Many people who don't use a model struggle to actually make progress in improving their posture. Without a clear goal, it's easy to go round in circles. You're left with just your feeling sense to tell you what is improvement and what is not. How are you going to reason out solutions? How are you going to problem solve? You're not. While a model could be imitated, that's not what we're aiming to do. The model allows us to reason about and understand coordinated movements. It allows us to make this murky, almost ethereal field of moving our own body something we can think about, speak about, reason about, and ultimately control with our conscious mind. The directions are a tool we use to orchestrate the movements needed to produce the positive changes that we've modeled. But we need the model to understand the directions, and also to assess the effect of the directions when we implement them. So while directions can be a powerful tool, having a clear and accurate model is what will allow you to actually unlock the transformative potential of verbal directions.